On top of continuing to face the structural challenges of load shedding, high unemployment levels and rising crime levels, South Africa will also face a series of more frequent, more severe and more impactful short-term crises alongside the rest of the world. And that's where we start business this afternoon. And of course, that's according to advisory firm PwC, which released its very first economic outlook for South Africa this year. And to give us more details on the findings is PwC South Africa senior economist, and that's Christie Viljoen. Thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. Now, improved sentiments from global business leaders on the economic growth forecasts for this year, Christie, but a series of crises in store. What's that about?
Well, we know South Africa has many challenges. You mentioned them: unemployment, load shedding, challenges with crime, railway. What we were looking at this report is actually the type of challenges that we're seeing in many countries around the world. Not the same everywhere, but sort of the same categories of impact. So we're thinking, for example, at the impact of conflict on supply chains. We're thinking of macroeconomic volatility, resource scarcity, the challenges in delivering healthcare, for example. So these are different points of challenges for 2024 that we as South Africans are experiencing, but also, as I said, elsewhere in the world, many other countries are seeing them as well.
And Christie, talk us through those 5 insights or those areas in society that you are concerned about, particularly in the South African context.
So on top of all our established and well-known challenges, the 5 items we're looking at this year is macroeconomic volatility. So that could be the exchange rate. It could be inflation, interest rates, for example, unpredictability, volatility in that. Another one is the impact of conflict, and that could be military conflict. It could be geopolitical, but the impact of that on supply chains, the ability to export and import. We as consumers are all dependent on importing goods that we consume. Many of us work for companies that need to export goods to make money. The third point that we can look at is resource scarcity. It's partly linked to the supply chain challenge, but it's something that we see all around the world. When you think of things like climate change, for example, scarcity in water, those types of elements, we are seeing a scarcity in commodities, and that's obviously pressuring prices. The challenge of financing healthcare. All around the world, we're seeing in the post-COVID situation where countries are struggling with their fiscal budgets. So as in South Africa, there's only so much money going around with the government. There's only so much you can spend on healthcare. And then the final one is pressure on institutions. And there we often look at public sector institutions. Again, globally, fiscal budgets under pressure. It stretches what governments can do. It impacts on their ability to deliver the quality and quantity of public services that they have been able to deliver in the past, even actually before the COVID situation. So those are just the 5 things that we are keeping an eye on, which is on our radar, in addition to, like I say, the well-known challenges we have in South Africa.
And now the conversation that we have been having in South Africa and really globally is the whole inflation versus interest rates conversation. Will a turn in interest rate hikes to reductions in the second half of the year help alleviate any of those pressure points?
A little bit. So we know that quite a few of these short-term crises are resulting in an increased cost of living. It's resulting in elevated prices for food, for electricity, different goods and services that we need as consumers, different inputs that we need as businesses. So the Reserve Bank would tell us that interest rates will come down once inflation starts moderating into that inflation target. So if we see a little bit of improvement in some of these points, we'll see inflation coming down, and that's what economists are expecting. That's why the forecast for interest rates to start coming down from about the middle of this year, at least the second half of next year. Interest rates have peaked, and the next move, most economists agree, will be lower. And that's great news for businesses, for consumers, anyone with debt, anyone that's got high repayments every month that compared to maybe 2-3 years ago was quite low. It's that debt burden that's sort of taking money away, in many cases, from spending on essentials like education and healthcare because you need to repay debt.
And Christie, Some of those, if not most of those 5 areas that you are concerned about as PwC are really areas that the country has been dealing with for quite some time when you talk about the load shedding and logistics. With those supply chain issues expected in this year as well, what does that bode for the country's economic growth forecast for not just 2024, but going into 2025 as well?
I think many of the forecasts we're seeing for economic growth this year is about 1%, maybe even less. It's a little bit better than last year, but not much, because we're expecting many of these big challenges to, even if there's some improvement, still being very, very big impact on business, for example. So even if we see lower levels of load shedding, for example, we know that electricity prices will go up significantly again this year. Even if we see an improvement in the quantity of goods that we can move by railway, for example, it's still very, very low and compared to what we saw even a few decades ago. So yes, some improvement is expected. A little bit of improvement in economic growth, but still, if we're getting excited about economic growth of 1%, we're really not setting the bar very high. That is less than our population growth. So we're actually still getting behind every year that these numbers are low. So it's challenging to be optimistic. And as we put out in this report, we've got these short-term challenges that we also need to deal with. It's not a great prognosis. And I think the good news will probably come from individual companies this year that somehow make it work, that make a plan, that they have a strategy, and somehow they get to be able to grow the business and grow employment as well.
So more resilience needed from the business landscape again in 2024. Thank you so much, Christie, for giving us those insights. And of course, that's PwC South Africa's senior economist, Christie Viljoen.